The Florida Everglades at night is a place of absolute darkness, a flat, endless stretch of sawgrass and black water where sound travels strangely. Insect calls echo, splashes linger, and the air itself feels heavy. But on the night of December 29th, 1972, that silence was shattered. A Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced commercial aircraft of its time, screamed out of the sky at 227 miles per hour. It didn't just crash, it disintegrated, tearing a wreckage field nearly a third of a mile long through mud, water, and reeds. Rescue teams would later describe debris scattered so widely that it was difficult to tell where the aircraft ended and the swamp began. Most ghost stories are tied to places: a house, a hotel, a stretch of road where something terrible happened. But what if the haunting didn't stay in the swamp? What if it followed the survivors back to the hangar? What if it appeared at 30,000 feet, reflected in polished steel and cockpit glass, inside the very machines built to replace the wreckage? Tonight we're opening the ghost file on Flight 401, an aircraft accident that became one of the most persistent, documented, and disturbing hauntings in aviation history. Welcome back to the Dark Folio, your creepy little coffee break. I'm May, and here we dig into the strange, the eerie, and the unexplained. Stories pulled from folklore, eyewitness accounts, and the darker corners of history. Now, a quick note before we begin. Every story I share is researched to the best of my ability, using available sources and records. But as with anything that lives in the shadows of folklore and the paranormal, details can shift, accounts can conflict, and not everything can be proven. So take what resonates and question what doesn't, and let's go. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was supposed to be routine, a post-holiday evening flight from New York's JFK to Miami. On board were 163 passengers and 13 crew members, families returning home, vacationers, business travelers. The aircraft was new, and the weather was clear. Everything about the flight suggested an uneventful landing. But as the plane began its descent into Miami International Airport, a single warning light failed to behave as expected. The landing gear indicator, a small green bulb, did not illuminate, and the crew couldn't tell if the gear hadn't deployed or if the bulb itself had burned out. So they began troubleshooting, and as we all know, sometimes little details get overlooked. As Captain Robert Loft and First Officer Bert Stockstill focused on the light assembly, it seems that Loft unintentionally nudged his control column. It was barely noticeable, but it disengaged the autopilot's altitude hold. Now, I don't know anything about a plane's operating system, but apparently this small nudge proved catastrophic. And yet there was no dramatic alert, no blaring alarm, no flashing lights, nothing to show that there was a problem. But from what I understand, because other autopilot systems remained active, the aircraft simply began a slow, silent, and nearly imperceptible descent. In other words, no one knew they were slowly going down. Flight engineer Don Repo was below the cockpit, inside the electronics bay, often grimly nicknamed the hellhole, trying to visually confirm the landing gear through a small porthole. Remember, that burned out light was supposed to be the indicator that the landing gear had deployed, and since it wasn't lit, he was literally there looking out a window trying to see if it had deployed. He never heard the low-altitude warning chime. At 11:42 p.m., Flight 401 struck the Everglades. 99 people died as a result of the crash itself. 2 more, including Don Repo, would later die from their injuries, bringing the final death toll to 101 souls. The investigation was thorough and unforgiving. The cause wasn't sabotage, it wasn't mechanical failure. Unfortunately, it was human error. A highly trained crew became so focused on a burned out light bulb that they didn't notice that this perfectly good airplane was flying itself into the ground. The landing gear, investigators confirmed, had been down the entire time. In the months that followed, Eastern Airlines began the grim process of recovery and rebuilding. And this is where the legend takes root. As was standard practice in aviation, usable components from the wreckage were reportedly salvaged. Now, my first thought was, what could be salvageable? I mean, apparently this was a catastrophic accident. There could have not been a lot that they could reuse. But apparently, the interior of the plane, a small section of it where the kitchen part, the galley, the ovens, the electronics racks, apparently some of those were salvageable. So they were clean, inspected, and certified for reuse. And according to long-standing accounts, those things like the galley sections, the ovens, the electronic racks from Flight 401, they were installed into other L-1011 aircraft in the fleet, most famously a jet known among crews as Ship 318. The airline officially denied this, but the people who worked those planes, they weren't so sure. It started quietly. A flight engineer performing a routine pre-flight inspection reported seeing a man seated in the cockpit jump seat. He wore an Eastern Airlines uniform, and the engineer recognized the face immediately. Captain Robert Loft, and when the engineer spoke to him, the seat was suddenly empty. And that was just the beginning. Loft began appearing on multiple aircraft, always in uniform, always solid, always real looking, enough that no one initially knew they were looking at a dead man. On one flight, a senior flight attendant noticed a man in a pilot's uniform sitting in first class, who hadn't been on the passenger manifest. She didn't recognize him at first. She reported it to the captain. He walked back with her, took one look at the man in the seat, and froze. "Oh my God," he said quietly. "That's Bob Loft." And then, without fading, without warning, Loft simply vanished. One moment there, the next, gone. The entire incident played out in front of nearly a dozen people. The flight was canceled. Crew members were too shaken to continue. There was another incident during a pre-flight ground check. Loft was reportedly spotted near the undercarriage of an aircraft, moving calmly around the landing gear, exactly as a flight engineer would before a departure. When approached, he told the ground crew not to bother with the checks. He said he had already done them, and the pilot of that flight canceled it on the spot. And then there was the sighting that reached all the way up the corporate ladder. A vice president of Eastern Airlines was aboard a flight when he noticed a man in a pilot's uniform seated nearby. He assumed it was the captain of the flight. They spoke briefly, and then the figure simply faded away. An Eastern Airlines executive, a vice president, watching a dead man disappear in front of his eyes. That is not a rumor passed down between nervous flight attendants. That is a senior company official, and he saw it too. Then came the stories of Don Repo. Repo didn't linger in the shadows or corners. He appeared where he had worked in life. Flight attendants aboard Ship 318 began reporting a man's face appearing in the reflective glass of the galley oven doors. In one widely repeated account, an attendant saw Repo's reflection clearly, so clearly that she spoke to him. He looked at her and said, "Watch out for fire on this airplane." She ran to get other crew members. 2 additional attendants saw the face, the same expression, before it faded from view. Days later, that aircraft experienced a serious engine failure and an onboard fire. But it wasn't just ovens. Repo was seen in the avionics bay of another L-1011, the exact same bay, the same cramped space below the cockpit where he had been working the night Flight 401 went down. In death, he was still checking the gear, still doing his job, and still in the hellhole. And then there's this story, which is so great. So there was a flight attendant who reported seeing a man, an engineer, working on a broken galley oven mid-flight. She watched him fix it, and then when she mentioned it later to the engineer, the only engineer that was on board the flight, he told her he'd never touched that oven. He'd never even been near it. Didn't even know it had been broken. But the oven was fixed. Apparently no one on board had done it. No one living, anyway. And then there's the story of a captain reported finding Repo in his cockpit before a flight. They spoke, and Repo looked at him and said, "There will never be another crash of an L-1011." And then he was gone. In the years that followed, through Eastern Airlines' entire remaining history, until the airline finally closed, there was not a single fatal crash on a TriStar fleet aircraft. Now, this is a good time to pause and point out something that I found interesting and unusual in the world of paranormal accounts. In all of the documented sightings, more than 20 separate witnesses over nearly 2 years, Loft and Repo were never seen together. Not once. Not on the same flight, not by the same witnesses, not at the same time. 2 men, 2 ghosts, apparently, dozens of sightings, but they were never in the same place simultaneously. I don't know. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to make of it. What do you make of it? Do you believe it's because they both held different responsibilities for the craft in their mind, so they showed up at different places? I don't know. What I do know is that the sightings were not vague or dreamlike according to the witnesses. They described the apparitions as solid, real, and calm. And because one more thing made this haunting different from nearly every other case on record, I thought you would find this interesting. According to multiple documented accounts, the sightings were reported to the U.S. Flight Safety Foundation, an independent aviation body, not a paranormal group, not a tabloid, and the foundation reportedly published a response in their 1974 newsletter, acknowledging that the reports came from, quote, experienced and trustworthy pilots and crew, and that they considered them significant. Now, I want to be straight with you here because, like I said, I do the work, I check it out, I've looked it up, and that 1974 newsletter, from what I have found, has never been digitized. The original documentation hasn't been located or verified online. Every source that cites that quote traces back to other paranormal sites, not to the newsletter itself. It may well be real. A 50-year-old industry publication is hardly guaranteed to be sitting in a Google search result, and it has been cited consistently for nearly 5 decades by researchers, journalists, and aviation writers, which suggests it wasn't simply invented from nothing. But I can't hand you that primary source because it's not been digitized. I haven't found it personally. All I can tell you is what has been passed down from year after year after year. Probably did originate from somewhere, but, you deserve to know that. I wanted to let you know that when you hear that there was a 1974 newsletter that talked about these ghosts, well, it's because they've heard it somewhere else. Just like I'm telling you now, I've heard it somewhere else. What I can tell you is that the witnesses were real, the accounts were documented, the airline's response, the suppression, the threats, the quiet removal of parts, things I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Well, it was real. And whether or not that newsletter quote is perfectly accurate, well, the pattern it describes absolutely is. So word spread quickly through Eastern Airlines. Certain tail numbers were avoided. Crew members quietly swapped shifts. Pilots requested reassignment. Multiple former employees would later claim that management strongly discouraged any written reports or discussions of paranormal sightings, implying that continuing to spread ghost stories could jeopardize careers. Employees who did speak out were sometimes sent to the company psychiatrist. Logbooks documenting the encounters reportedly disappeared. Officially, Eastern denied everything. Unofficially, fear circulated through crew lounges and cockpits. And then, just as suddenly as the sightings began, they stopped. According to long-standing legend, it's because the airline eventually removed every remaining salvaged component associated with Flight 401 and disposed of them entirely. There's even a reported account of a fundamentalist Christian pilot who performed a full exorcism aboard the L-1011 with the most documented sightings. I find that totally interesting. I'd love to find some documentation on that, but nevertheless, once the parts were gone, so were the ghosts. Before we go any further, let me pause right here. If you're enjoying this episode of The Dark Folio with me, May, and with my little fur buddy companion here, make sure you're following the show so you don't miss future ghost files. And speaking of my little fur buddy, if you ever hear some noises in the background, it's because it's almost completely impossible to cut and produce this podcast without this dog making some little noise or wanting to be right up underneath of me. He's my baby, and he wants my full attention all of the time. So if you hear him snoring, which is possible, or little clicky clacks where he's jumping up and down, just know that you're being visited by my fur baby. So please leave a review, especially on Spotify or Apple Podcast. It helps this podcast reach new listeners more than you might think. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching The Dark Folio, where we share episode updates, behind-the-scene notes, and future stories, and all kinds of interesting things. Feel free to reach out and leave us some comments, some feedback. I'd love to hear from you. One of my dedicated listeners let me know that she wanted to hear more about Skeleton Lake, and I had to tell her there's not a lot more to tell. I told you what I know because it is still a mystery. So let's talk about how far this story has traveled. Here's something I love about this case. It didn't just haunt the skies, it haunted our screens, our bookshelves, our podcast feeds, and if you're a fan of a certain Two Brothers in a Black Impala, it's haunted your television. The story was so massive, so documented, so impossible to ignore, that within 6 years of the crash, it had already been turned into a book and a made-for-TV movie. John G. Fuller, a journalist known for investigating the unexplained, spent years researching the sightings, the cover-up, and the crew. His 1976 book, The Ghosts of Flight 401, became the definitive account, and in 1978, it was adapted into a TV movie of the same name, starring Ernest Borgnine. Think about that, a real aviation haunting, adapted for television, less than a decade after it happened. That's not folklore quietly passed down over generations. That's a story so loud that it couldn't be contained, and it made it to popular media, and it kept echoing. Paranormal television found it irresistible. Unsolved Mysteries, the gold standard of I'm not sleeping tonight television, covered the crash and the ghost sightings during its original run. And if you grew up watching that show like I did, there's a good chance Flight 401 is part of why you're here listening to this podcast right now. More recently, the story got the full documentary treatment with Shock Docs, Ghost of Flight 401 on Discovery Plus, where paranormal investigator Steve Shippey and psychic medium Cindy Kaza actually went to the crash site in the Everglades at night on the 50th anniversary of the disaster. If you haven't seen it, it is worth the watch. But the reference that really thrills the paranormal nerd in me, the one that when I saw it, I said, I know that story. Like I said, Two Brothers, Black Impala, baby, Supernatural. If you like the show Supernatural and you watch it, if you're a fan, I bet that hearing the story you said, I know that story. It was in one of the first episodes of Supernatural. Yes, it was. Season 1, Episode 4, called Phantom Traveler. In the episode, Sam and Dean Winchester are called in to investigate a plane crash caused by a demonic entity. And right there in the middle of the dialogue, Sam brings up Flight 401 by name. Dean picks it up and explains it plainly. The plane crashed, the airline salvaged parts, put them into another aircraft, and the spirits of the pilot and the co-pilot followed. It's delivered so casually, so matter-of-factly, like every hunter just knows this case. The show swapped the real-world ghosts of Captain Bob Loft and Don Repo for a crash-causing demon to fit, obviously, the show Supernatural's mythology. But the bones of the story, the salvaged parts, the haunting that traveled, well, they are lifted directly from the Flight 401 legend that Sam brings up. The writers knew exactly what they were referencing, and the episode number itself, Season 1, Episode 4, 104, is widely considered a quiet nod to the flight number. And that's the thing about a story this good. It doesn't just get remembered, it gets borrowed. In the podcast world, we keep coming back to it too. The Mr. Ballin podcast dedicated a full episode to The Haunting, episode 107, I believe, with that signature slow burn suspense that makes his storytelling so effective. Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf did a deep dive into Fuller's original book, walking through the sightings and the cover-up chapter by chapter. And our friends over at the Oddity Shop podcast covered it beautifully in their episode Beyond the Crash, focusing heavily on what it means that the ghosts seem to be helping, not harming, which honestly is the part that I think a lot of people focus on. These weren't malevolent hauntings, not the scary ghosts that we watch on our TV screens. No one was threatened. No one was chased. Loft and Repo appeared calm, purposeful, like men who still had a job to do. Men who wanted to warn and keep people safe. Was this mass hallucination? Skeptics argue that the aviation community is intensely close-knit. Grief, stress, and long hours can distort perception. Once rumors of dead man's parts began circulating, every reflection and flicker of light may have taken on new meaning. But the question remains, how do you explain dozens of independent accounts, pilots with thousands of flight hours, engineers trained to trust instruments, not intuition, flight attendants with no reason to fabricate stories, a vice president of the airline, an independent aviation safety foundation willing to put its name on record, allegedly, all describing the same two men. Maybe the sightings were stress-induced illusions. Maybe they were the echoes of a tragedy the airline tried too hard to bury. But let's think of it like this. Aviation is built on responsibility. And when a captain closes the cockpit door, they are responsible for every soul behind it until the wheels touch the runway again. And if the stories of Flight 401 are true, Robert Loft and Don Repo weren't haunting out of rage or confusion. They were simply refusing to clock out. They stayed with the parts that failed them, making sure that this time everyone made it home. And if Repo's final promise is to be believed, if that quiet, certain word to a captain in an empty cockpit meant anything, then maybe they kept that promise. No more fatal crashes, not one. Flight 401 may have ended in the swamp, but its crew, apparently, well, they never truly left the sky. Thank you for joining me on this Ghost File. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to follow, review, and share the Dark Folio with fellow kindred spirits. This has been the Dark Folio. Stay curious and stay a little dark. I'll see you in the next file.